In the heart of central India, in a city built around two lakes, there once stood a kingdom ruled for 4 generations not by kings, but by queens. Bhopal was one of the only princely states in the world, Muslim or otherwise, governed by an unbroken line of female rulers, women who held court, commanded troops, negotiated directly with the British Empire, and built some of the largest mosques on the subcontinent, all while much of the world still debated whether a woman could inherit a chair, let alone a throne. When the kingdom finally did fall, when independence and partition tore the map of India into pieces, the family did not fade into ordinary obscurity the way so many royal houses did. Its bloodline split in 2 directions and reassembled itself in places nobody would have predicted: on a cricket pitch, in front of a film camera, inside gossip columns that had no idea they were writing about the descendants of an empire. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. One daughter of the last Nawab renounced her birthright and crossed the new border into Pakistan, never to rule anything again. Another daughter stayed behind, married a prince who captained the Indian cricket team, and produced a grandson who lost an eye in a car accident and still led his country onto the field. That grandson's own son grew up to become one of the biggest film stars in the country his ancestors once ruled, married to a woman from a family sometimes called Bollywood's own royalty. This is the story of what happened to Bhopal's royal family after their kingdom fell. The story begins nearly 3 centuries ago with a soldier of fortune named Dost Mohammad Khan. He was an Afghan mercenary who had served in the armies of the Mughal Empire, and when that empire began to crumble in the early 1700s, he did what ambitious soldiers throughout history have done. He carved out territory for himself. By 1723, Dost Muhammad Khan had established Bhopal as his own princely state. Built around a fortress and a lake the locals believed had been dug centuries earlier by a legendary king. His descendants ruled that state for the better part of 250 years, and for most of that time, the throne did not pass from father to son the way it did almost everywhere else in the region. It passed from mother to daughter 4 times in a row, in a part of the world where that kind of succession had almost no precedent at all. The first of these female rulers was Qudsiya Begum, who took power in 1819 after her husband died in what was officially recorded as a hunting accident, though the circumstances stayed murky enough that historians still argue about them. Qudsiya became regent for her infant daughter, and she governed with a bluntness that scandalized the conservative nobles around her. She refused to wear the veil while conducting the business of state, insisting that a ruler could not run a government from behind a curtain, and she personally trained her daughter for the role she herself had never expected to hold. Her daughter, Sikandar Begum, inherited that bluntness and sharpened it further. Sikandar rode into battle herself, wore a turban instead of traditional women's dress while commanding troops, and studied fortification and artillery with the same seriousness her male counterparts in neighboring states applied to poetry and court ritual. When the great uprising against British rule broke out across India in 1857, she made a calculated decision to side with the British rather than the rebels who controlled much of the surrounding region. It was a controversial choice among her own people, and one that other Muslim rulers openly criticized her for, but it paid off politically. In gratitude, the British recognized her not as a regent holding power on behalf of someone else, but as a ruler in her own right. One of the rare occasions the British Empire formally acknowledged a Muslim woman as a sovereign in her own name, rather than as a placeholder for a future king. Her daughter Shah Jahan Begum came next, and she used the wealth of the state to begin construction on one of the largest mosques in Asia, the Taj-ul-Masajid, a project so ambitious it outlived her by nearly a century. Funding stalled not long after her death, and the mosque sat half-finished for decades, its unfinished minarets standing over the city as a strange monument to a queen's unfinished ambition, until workers finally completed the structure generations later. Shah Jahan Begum's own reign was not without controversy either. Her second marriage to a man from outside the established court hierarchy unsettled the nobility and briefly threatened her hold on power, a reminder that even a reigning queen in Bhopal still had to navigate the same court politics that had toppled kings elsewhere. After Shah Jahan came Sultan Jahan Begum, who ruled from 1901 to 1926. She was, by most accounts, the most contradictory of the 4 Begums. She maintained a strict and conservative religious household even as she pushed hard for girls' education across the state. founding schools and colleges at a pace few Indian rulers of either gender attempted, and eventually becoming Chancellor of Aligarh Muslim University, one of the most influential institutions in the country. When the time came to choose her own successor, Sultan Jahan passed over her two eldest sons, whom she judged unfit to govern, and handed the throne instead to her third son. His name was Hamidullah Khan, and he would be the last person to rule Bhopal as an independent state. By the time Sultan Jahan's reign ended, Bhopal had built a reputation unlike any other princely state in India, a place where a woman's face appeared on official currency, where girls attended state-funded schools 2 generations before independence, and where visiting British officials sometimes admitted, in private letters home, that they found themselves negotiating with rulers sharper and better prepared than most of the men who held neighboring thrones. The palace complex itself grew accordingly, a sprawl of durbar halls, private apartments, and formal gardens built up over 4 separate reigns, each Begum adding her own wing, her own fountain, her own architectural signature, to a residence that had started, under Dost Mohammad Khan, as little more than a fortified camp. Hamidullah Khan came to power in 1926 as the first male ruler Bhopal had seen in 4 generations, and in his own way he proved just as forceful as the women who came before him. He served as Chancellor of Aligarh Muslim University, the same post his mother had held, and he became one of the most prominent voices inside the Chamber of Princes, the body that represented India's hundreds of semi-independent royal states under British rule, eventually rising to lead it. He was also a close political ally of Muhammad Ali Jinnah and a committed supporter of the Muslim League, hosting Jinnah as a personal guest in Bhopal on more than one occasion, and as the British Empire prepared to leave India in 1947, Hamidullah found himself in an impossible position, caught between his own political loyalties and the map that geography had actually handed him. When India was partitioned that year, the hundreds of princely states scattered across the subcontinent were each given a choice: join India, join the newly created Pakistan, or in theory, remain independent. Bhopal sat in the geographic middle of India, hundreds of miles from the new Pakistani border, which made independence nearly impossible to sustain, and joining Pakistan a practical fantasy. Hamidullah resisted anyway. For a time he hoped Bhopal might avoid absorption into India altogether, the same hope that briefly drove the ruler of Hyderabad to declare independence, before Indian troops marched in and settled the argument by force. Hamidullah never went that far. Under sustained pressure from the new Indian government, and in particular from the Deputy Prime Minister Sardar Patel, who spent much of 1947 and 1948 persuading, cajoling, and occasionally threatening reluctant princes into signing away their sovereignty one state at a time, Hamidullah finally accepted the inevitable. By 1949, Bhopal had formally acceded to India. The kingdom Dost Muhammad Khan had carved out of a crumbling empire 226 years earlier was no longer a kingdom, it was a district. Hamidullah kept his title, his palace, and a government pension known as a privy purse, the arrangement India offered its former royal families in exchange for their cooperation. He remained a public figure until his death in 1960, still respected in diplomatic and academic circles even after his political influence had effectively ended. But the question that would determine what became of this particular royal family was never really about Hamidullah. It was about his daughters. He had no son, and under the old rules of Bhopal succession, that meant the throne, or whatever remained of it, would once again pass to a woman. Hamidullah had married early and remained devoted, by most household accounts, to the education of his 3 daughters, in an era when many ruling families across India still restricted their daughters to private tutors and domestic training. All 3 girls learned to ride, to shoot, and to argue policy at the family dinner table, a kind of preparation that assumed at least one of them would eventually have to lead. Nobody in the family, least of all Hamidullah himself, expected that preparation to matter quite as much as it eventually would, or that it would end up splitting his daughters across a border that did not even exist when they were born. Hamidullah's eldest daughter, Abida Sultan, had been raised from childhood to rule. She was an expert polo player and a skilled hunter, and she became one of the first Indian women to earn a pilot's license, a woman who seemed built for the same forceful, unapologetic leadership that had defined every Begum of Bhopal before her. She had been formally trained in statecraft from an early age, sitting in on council meetings her father held, and by her own account she expected to inherit the throne outright. She was also, like her father, a committed supporter of the Muslim League, and a personal friend of Jinnah's own family. As partition approached, Abida made no secret of where her sympathies lay. As her father's negotiations with India dragged on, she grew increasingly convinced that her future, and the future of her faith, belonged in the new state of Pakistan rather than in a Bhopal absorbed into a Hindu-majority India. In 1950, a year after her father signed Bhopal into India, Abida Sultan made a decision that would reshape the entire family's history. She left. She crossed the border into Pakistan with her young son, formally renounced her claim to the Bhopal succession, and started a new life as a citizen of a country that had not existed a few years earlier. She went on to work within Pakistan's civil administration, later taking on diplomatic assignments abroad and writing candidly in her memoirs about the frustration of watching a throne she had trained her whole life for pass instead to her sister, but she would never again hold a royal title of any kind. The eldest daughter of the last Nawab of Bhopal, the woman trained since birth to be a queen, chose exile over inheritance. That decision left the succession, or the ceremonial version of it that still existed under Indian law, to Hamidullah's second daughter, Sajida Sultan. Unlike her sister, Sajida had already built a life outside the direct orbit of Bhopal politics. In 1939, more than a decade before partition, she had married a man named Iftikhar Ali Khan, the ruling Nawab of a much smaller princely state called Pataudi, tucked between Delhi and the Punjab plains. On paper, it was simply a marriage between two royal families of the kind that had been arranged across the subcontinent for centuries. Nobody involved could have predicted that this particular marriage would become the hinge on which the entire second half of the Bhopal story would turn. Iftikhar Ali Khan Pataudi was not a typical ruling prince. He was, by the standards of his era, one of the finest cricketers in the world. He had played Test cricket for England in the early 1930s, part of a touring squad in Australia, so notoriously aggressive it became known as the Bodyline series, and he reportedly grew so uncomfortable with England's brutal tactics that he refused to take up a fielding position designed purely to injure the Australian batsman, a stance that put him at odds with his own captain. Years later, after independence, he captained India itself, becoming one of the only cricketers in history to lead both England and India onto a test match field, a distinction that has never been matched more than a handful of times since. He was exactly the kind of internationally connected, publicly glamorous figure that Sajida Sultan's family had never quite produced on its own, a prince whose fame came from a sport rather than a throne. English newspapers of the era wrote about him almost as often for his elegant batting technique as for his princely title, and Indian cricket officials later courted him specifically because his combination of aristocratic pedigree and genuine sporting talent made him a unifying figure at a time when the newly independent country's cricket board was still assembling players and administrators from dozens of formerly separate princely and provincial teams. Their marriage placed the Bhopal bloodline directly inside Indian cricket's inner circle, and it would stay there for 3 more generations. Iftikhar Ali Khan did not live to see most of what followed. In 1952, at the age of 41, he collapsed and died of a heart attack while playing polo, the same sport that had defined his wife's side of the family for generations before him. He left behind Sajida, who in 1960 inherited the ceremonial title of Nawab Begum of Bhopal upon her father's death, becoming the last person to hold that title with any recognition at all. And he left behind a young son who was not yet 11 years old, suddenly the head of 2 royal lines with nothing left to actually govern. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. That son's name was Mansoor Ali Khan Pataudi, though the country that watched him grow up would come to know him almost universally by a single nickname, Tiger. He inherited his father's talent for cricket early, and by the time he reached Oxford University, he was already being discussed as a future captain of the Indian national team, a prospect that seemed to promise the family a very different kind of prominence than any throne could offer. Then, in 1961, while still a student in England, he was in a serious car accident that drove a shard of glass into his right eye. Doctors told him he would probably never play competitive cricket again. He had lost most of the vision in that eye permanently, and for months afterward he relearned how to judge a fast-moving cricket ball with only one working eye, a skill most players never have to think about at all. He played anyway. Barely a year after the accident, at the age of 21, Tiger Pataudi was named captain of the Indian cricket team, becoming the youngest test captain in the sport's history at that time, a young man leading his country's most beloved sporting institution while functionally blind in one eye. He captained India for most of the following decade, and former teammates and cricket historians alike have credited him with instilling a fighting spirit in a team that had spent much of its earlier history losing meekly and apologetically to stronger opponents. Whatever throne his family had once held in Bhopal, Tiger Pataudi built himself a different kind of public standing entirely, earned through performance rather than inheritance, in front of packed stadiums instead of courtiers and ministers. Cricket writers of the period sometimes reached for the same comparison, noting that the bluntness and refusal to defer that had defined Qudsiya Begum and Sikandar Begum more than a century earlier seemed to run just as strongly through their descendant, only now expressed through field placements and batting orders instead of court decrees. Tiger rarely spoke publicly about the throne his family had lost. When journalists raised it, he tended to steer the conversation back to cricket, treating the captaincy itself as the only inheritance that mattered to him. In 1969, he married Sharmila Tagore, one of the most celebrated actresses in Indian cinema at the time, a woman from a prominent Bengali family with its own long history of literary and artistic achievement. The wedding itself became a national event, covered by newspapers that had spent decades treating cricket and cinema as separate worlds and now suddenly had to cover both at once. The marriage merged two different kinds of Indian fame, the fading aristocratic prestige of the Bhopal and Pataudi bloodlines, and the rising cultural power of a film industry that was quickly becoming India's most visible export to the world. 2 years later, in 1971, the Indian government passed a constitutional amendment abolishing privy purses altogether, stripping every former royal family in the country, Bhopal's included, of whatever formal recognition still remained on paper. Whatever throne Sajida Sultan had nominally inherited 11 years earlier now legally ceased to exist. From that point forward, being a Nawab or a Begum in India was not a legal status of any kind. It had become simply a name people continued to use out of habit, respect, or nostalgia. And it was into that strange, unofficial kind of royalty, real in the public imagination but non-existent on paper, that the next generation of the family was born. Tiger and Sharmila had 3 children. Their son, Saif Ali Khan, was born in 1970. Their daughters, Saba Ali Khan and Soha Ali Khan, grew up alongside him in a household that straddled 2 very different worlds, one filled with the trophies and traditions of a cricketing dynasty, the other filled with film scripts and premieres. Saba would eventually build a career as a jewelry designer, drawing on the family's own history of Mughal and Bhopal-era craftsmanship for inspiration, while Soha followed her mother into acting, appearing in a string of Hindi films through the 2000s and 2010s, and later moving into television and writing. But it was Saif who carried the family name furthest into the spotlight, and whose life would end up braiding the family's 2 halves, royal and cinematic, more tightly together than any marriage before his had managed. Saif Ali Khan became an actor, and within a decade he had established himself as one of the most successful and critically respected leading men in Hindi cinema, a rare combination of box office draw and serious dramatic performer able to move between broad comedies, prestige dramas, and action films without losing credibility in any of them. Critics frequently pointed out the apparent contradiction of a man descended from 2 of India's most storied bloodlines, building his reputation instead on unglamorous, hard-working versatility, taking supporting roles as often as leading ones, and producing films through his own company, rather than waiting for studios to come calling. It was a career built, deliberately or not, on the same instinct for reinvention that had carried the family through Partition, cricket, and everything in between. When his father died in 2011, Saif traveled to the town of Pataudi for a ceremony that carried no legal weight whatsoever, but held enormous symbolic weight within the family and the surrounding community, a gathering of relatives and local well-wishers rather than any kind of state occasion. He was informally recognized there as the new Nawab of Pataudi, a title with no government standing, no land grant, and no army attached to it, but one that newspapers and fans kept using anyway, partly out of tradition and partly because it made for a better headline than his given name ever could. His personal life mirrored the family's larger pattern of collision between old aristocracy and new celebrity. He married the actress Amrita Singh in 1991, and the couple had 2 children, Sara Ali Khan and Ibrahim Ali Khan, both of whom would themselves later become actors, carrying the family's public visibility into a 4th generation of performers. That marriage ended in divorce in 2004. In 2012, Saif married again, this time to Kareena Kapoor, an actress from a family that had shaped Indian cinema across 4 generations and was routinely described in the press as something close to Bollywood royalty in its own right. Her great-grandfather had been one of the founding figures of Indian cinema on stage and screen, and her grandfather and great-uncles had gone on to build some of the most successful production houses and starring careers in the history of the Hindi film industry. When Kareena married Saif, two of India's most recognizable dynasties merged into a single household, an actual princely bloodline stretching back to an 18th-century Afghan mercenary, joined to a cinematic bloodline that had, across a different kind of century, become just as much a fixture of the national imagination. Newspapers at the time of the wedding leaned hard into the framing, running headlines that treated the marriage less like a celebrity pairing and more like a dynastic merger, complete with side-by-side family trees and comparisons to the arranged unions that had once bound Bhopal to other princely states generations earlier, even though this particular match had nothing arranged about it at all. Their 2 sons, Taimur, born in 2016, and Jehangir, known publicly as Jay, born in 2021, grew up with a level of press attention few children anywhere in the world experience. Photographers waited outside their home for years. Their birthday parties made national news. Their outfits, their expressions, and their toys became the subject of magazine spreads and social media commentary on a near-weekly basis, an entire minor industry of attention built around 2 small boys who, under Indian law, held no title, no land, and no formal claim to anything their great-great-grandmother once ruled. It was, in its own way, a kind of royalty after all, not the kind written into any constitution, but the kind Indian popular culture had constructed and sustained on its own, built out of cricket highlights, film premieres, and decades of front-page fascination with one particular family. Indian entertainment journalists eventually gave the phenomenon its own shorthand, referring to Taimur simply as the most photographed toddler in the country, a title that, unlike Nawab or Begum, actually meant something in measurable terms of magazine sales and social media engagement. It was an odd kind of continuity. A family once defined by court protocol and formal titles now defined instead by camera flashes and trending hashtags. The mechanisms of fame updated for a different century, but the basic fact of public fascination carried forward largely unchanged. The physical remnants of the actual kingdom told a more complicated story than the tabloids did. Pataudi Palace, the family's ancestral home on the Pataudi side, sat in disrepair for years, its gardens overgrown and its halls closed to visitors, before Saif Ali Khan invested in restoring parts of it, eventually opening sections of the estate for weddings and private events, a working monument rather than a museum piece behind glass. On the Bhopal side, meanwhile, several of the family's old properties became entangled in a long-running legal dispute after Indian authorities moved to classify them as enemy property, a designation tied to the fact that Abida Sultan, the daughter who had left for Pakistan 7 decades earlier, was technically still an heir under the old lines of succession. Government custodians moved to take formal control of the properties, family lawyers filed counterclaims, and hearings stretched across more than one court and more than one decade, with neither side treating the matter as settled. The case dragged through Indian courts for years, moving between local benches and higher appeals, a strange bureaucratic echo of the exact same partition that had split the family apart in the first place, still being argued over generations after the people who caused the split had died. There is something fitting, and more than a little strange, about the shape this family's story took. 4 generations of women ruled Bhopal for reasons that had almost nothing to do with tradition and everything to do with circumstance, ambition, and occasionally sheer stubbornness, the combination that kept putting daughters on the throne instead of sons. When the kingdom itself finally dissolved, absorbed into a newly independent India with no room left for princes and princesses, the family did not simply retreat into private life the way so many former royal houses eventually did. It found new stages. A cricket pitch became a kind of throne room, where a young man who had lost sight in one eye led his country through sheer force of will. A film set became another, where his son built a career out of talent rather than title. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a sister who wanted no part of any of it packed her belongings, crossed a new and unfamiliar border, and built an entirely separate life in a country that did not yet exist when she was born. It is worth sitting for a moment with what exactly was lost and what was not. Bhopal lost its army, its treasury, its seat at the negotiating table, and eventually its legal existence as anything other than a city on a map. It did not lose its capacity to produce people the rest of the country could not stop watching. Whether they were watching a young captain refuse to let a damaged eye end his career, a movie star informally recognized in a ceremony with no legal standing, or two small boys chased by photographers who had no idea what a privy purse even was. The four Begums who built the state understood something about visibility and public presence that their descendants, without ever studying court history, seemed to have inherited anyway. None of it restored the throne. All of it kept the family in a version of the public eye that has now outlasted the throne itself by more than half a century, with no sign of fading. Bhopal itself moved on the way capital cities usually do. The lakes are still there. Some of the old palaces still stand, repurposed as government offices or heritage hotels, while a few others sit behind locked gates, slowly falling apart, their gardens reclaimed by weeds. The Taj-ul-Masajid, the mosque Shah Jahan Begum began building more than a century and a half ago and never lived to see finished, now hosts one of the largest religious gatherings in India each year. Thousands of worshippers filling a courtyard commissioned by a queen most of them have probably never heard of. Tour guides who walk visitors through the old city still point out which wing belonged to which Begum, a small ongoing act of memory that survives independently of anything the family itself has done to preserve it. And the family itself continues, scattered across acting careers, old estates, and courtrooms, still sorting out who technically owns what. 4 generations removed from the last woman who ruled Bhopal as an actual sovereign state. They are not royalty anymore. Not legally, not in any sense the Indian Constitution recognizes. But walk into almost any newsstand in the country, and their faces are still on the cover. People are still arguing over their weddings, their children, and their movies with the same intensity earlier generations once reserved for questions of succession and inheritance. The throne is gone. The audience never left. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.